What if Samus Aran hunted in the Delta Quadrant? Section 1. The Delta Quadrant did not care about you. That was the first thing every Voyager crew member learned. Not in a briefing, not from Janeway's measured briefings in the mess hall, but in the marrow. Out here, 70,000 light-years from the warm, bureaucratic embrace of the Federation, space had a different quality to it. It pressed closer. The stars felt older and less interested in what happened between them. Civilizations that had risen and fallen a dozen times before humanity discovered fire left their ruins drifting through nebulae with no one to mourn them. The Delta Quadrant was not hostile. It was simply indifferent. And indifference at this scale had a weight to it that optimism struggled to carry alone. Lieutenant Commander Tuvok had noted the anomaly at 0347 hours, a ship's time. He did not use the word anomaly lightly. After 3 years aboard Voyager, the term had been stretched to cover phenomena ranging from the genuinely inexplicable to the merely inconvenient. This qualified as the former. The spatial distortion appeared without precedent in any Federation database, generating an energy signature that the computer cycled through 17 classification attempts before returning a result that was, in Tuvok's estimation, less a classification and more an admission of defeat. Unknown origin, non-standard dimensional topology, recommend caution. He had recommended caution. He always recommended caution. No one ever took him up on it. Captain Catherine Janeway was on the bridge within 4 minutes, coffee in hand, her eyes carrying the particular sharpness of someone who had trained herself to wake up already thinking. She studied the view screen. The anomaly pulsed, a slow, rhythmic contraction and expansion, like something breathing. Its edges crackling with energy that the ship's sensors kept trying to categorize as plasma, then as gravitational shear, then as something the computer didn't have a word for and kept rendering as a string of question marks in the readout. "It's not natural," Ensign Kim said from Ops, which Janeway thought was the understatement of the current stardate. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." She set her coffee down. "Tuvok, are we looking at an artificial construct? The energy pattern suggests engineered origin. The mathematics of the topology are precise, deliberate." He paused, which from Tuvok was practically an exclamation point. Someone built this. The anomaly exhaled. What came through was not a Federation vessel. It was not Hirogen. It bore no resemblance to anything in Voyager's accumulated 3 years of Delta Quadrant encounters. And Voyager had encountered things that most Federation xenobiologists would have spent careers not believing. The ship that tumbled out of the collapsing rift was compact and angular, built with the aggressive purposefulness of a weapon rather than a vehicle, curved armor plating in deep orange and gold, surfaces scorched along the port side from what sensors immediately identified as weapons discharge. The kind of weapons discharge that suggested whoever had been shooting at it very recently. The rift collapsed behind it like a wound sealing shut. Hull integrity on the vessel. "It's bad," Kim reported, voice tight. "Life support is failing. I'm reading one life sign. Humanoid. Barely." Janeway was already moving. "Get a transporter lock. The suit she's wearing, there's some kind of energy field. Transporter's having trouble." "She?" "Biosigns are female, human adjacent. Captain, she's got maybe 4 minutes before life support goes completely." Janeway made the call the way she always made calls out here, quickly without the luxury of deliberation. "Lock on to the life sign and beam her directly to sickbay. Ignore the field. Tom, get us closer to that ship. I want a tractor beam on it before it drifts into the debris field. Harry, I want to know everything about that vessel's last 12 hours the moment we have her stable." She picked her coffee back up. "And someone wake the doctor." The transporter managed it on the 3rd attempt. What materialized on the sickbay bio bed was not, strictly speaking, a person. Not at first glance. It was a suit of armor that the EMH's medical sensors immediately flagged as containing organic material, because the suit and the person inside it were not entirely separate things. The doctor, to his considerable credit, did not say anything about this for nearly 15 seconds, which was a personal record. "Fascinating," he said instead, running his tricorder in a slow arc. "The suit's integrated with her biology at, I'm counting 11 distinct neurological connection points. This isn't technology she's wearing, Captain. It's technology she's become. He looked up. The good news is her biosigns are stabilizing. The suit appears to have gone into some kind of protective state, redistributing power to keep her alive. Whatever external systems failed, it kept the critical ones running. Can you wake her? I can. I'd recommend waiting until she's had time to. The figure on the biobed sat up. It was not the slow, disoriented awakening of someone pulled back from the edge of system failure. It was immediate and total, a shift from stillness to absolute presence that had the doctor taking an involuntary step backward. The visor was dark, but it tracked. She took in the room the way a person took in a potential threat. Exits, personnel, distances, the soft hum of ship systems that were not her ship systems. Her arm cannon came up. Whoa! The doctor raised both hands, which was a purely reflexive human gesture he had never entirely unlearned. You're aboard a Federation starship, USS Voyager. You were rescued from your damaged vessel. No one here is a threat. The cannon stayed level for 4 seconds. Then it lowered. Not because she trusted him, Janeway sensed, but because she was performing the same rapid calculation Janeway performed in every new tactical situation. What do I know? What don't I know? And what does acting prematurely cost me? The answer, apparently, was, wait. Janeway stepped forward. She had introduced herself to beings of incomprehensible power, to species that viewed her crew as food, to civilizations that had no concept of individual identity. She applied the same tone she always did, steady, respectful, honest. I'm Captain Catherine Janeway. You're safe. A beat. Hey, can you tell me your name? The visor regarded her. When the voice came, it was level and unhurried, carrying the particular flatness of someone who had learned long ago that most conversations were a waste of time. Samus Aran, bounty hunter. Another pause, shorter. What universe is this? Janeway held her gaze. In 3 years of impossibilities, that was a new one. Ours, she said, and we'd very much like to understand how you got here. She allowed herself the smallest professional smile. I suspect the answer is going to be complicated. Samus said nothing. She looked at the wall where the view screen was dark, then back at the captain. It always is. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Janeway gave her 2 hours, not out of generosity, though Janeway was, by nature, a generous person, but out of tactical pragmatism. She had learned through encounters that would have broken someone less stubborn that the first conversation with an unknown variable was the most important one, and the most important conversations required both parties to be operating at full capacity. Samus Aran had been 4 minutes from death when they pulled her through. Whatever she was, whatever she carried, deserved the respect of a proper introduction. She spent those 2 hours productively. By the time she walked back into sickbay with Chakotay at her shoulder, she had read every sensor report Harry Kim had compiled on the recovered vessel, every bioscan the doctor had managed before his patient made clear she was done being scanned, and a preliminary analysis from 7 of 9 that was, characteristically, more unsettling than reassuring. Samus was standing when they arrived. She had declined the biobed. She stood near the viewport instead, watching the stars in a way that told Janeway she wasn't actually watching the stars. She was using the reflection in the transparent aluminum to monitor the room behind her. Old habit. The armor was fully powered now, its orange plating catching Voyager's running lights in warm geometric angles, the shoulder cannon at rest but present. She turned when they entered, and out in the visor caught Janeway with the particular attention of someone who had already decided what they thought and was now testing whether they were right. Captain, Chakotay said quietly as they crossed the threshold, she hasn't eaten, hasn't slept, hasn't spoken to anyone since you left. I know, Janeway said. Neither would I. She dismissed the security officer posted by the door with a small nod, a deliberate signal, and crossed to the viewport. She didn't crowd the space. She stopped at a respectful distance and looked out at the same stars. Your ship is secured in our shuttle bay. she said. "We haven't attempted to access it. I want to be clear that we won't without your permission." A beat. "We also haven't attempted to remove your suit, which, according to my doctor, is fortunate. Was because he's not entirely sure we could." Something shifted in the set of Samus's shoulders. Not relaxation, recognition. "The ship can't be repaired with what you have," Samus said. It wasn't a question. "Our chief engineer is optimistic," Janeway replied, which was always true of B'Elanna Torres, and not always helpful. "She'd like to speak with you about the propulsion system when you're ready. The energy signatures are unlike anything we've encountered." She paused. "In fact, that's something of a theme with you so far." Samus turned from the viewport. In the direct light of sickbay, she was, the doctor's scans had established this, human in her fundamental architecture, though the Chozo influence ran through her cellular structure like a second language written over the first. Her biosigns ran hotter than baseline human. To her reflexes, even at rest, carried the latent tension of someone whose nervous system had been recalibrated for a different category of threat. "Where are we?" she asked. Chakotay stepped forward and pulled up a spatial display on the nearest console. A blue-white map of their current position, Voyager's course plotted in a dotted amber line, stretching toward the distant smear of Federation space. "Delta Quadrant, approximately 65,000 light-years from Earth. We've been traveling toward home for 3 years." He indicated the anomaly's recorded position. "You came through here. We've been calling it a spatial rift, though that's an approximation. Our sensors don't have a proper classification for it." Samus studied the map with the focus of someone reading tactical data. The Chozo built transit infrastructure across multiple systems. Some of it was designed to function across what my universe would call dimensional boundaries. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone reporting findings rather than confiding. "I was pursuing a space pirate vessel that had accessed a dormant Chozo gate. I followed them through. The gate collapsed behind us both. The ship that was shooting at you," Janeway said, "was destroyed in the transit. The gates collapsed, tore it apart. Not satisfaction, simply data. I sustained damage from the debris field before the rift sealed." Chakotay and Janeway exchanged a look. In the shorthand of 3 years and 1,000 impossible decisions, that look contained an entire conversation. She's telling the truth. She's holding something back. She's not hostile. She's not safe. And we need her. "I need to be direct with you, Samus," Janeway said. "We are a long way from home by any definition, yours or mine. Your ship can't make the transit back without extensive repair. And I'll be honest, I don't know if we can provide what it needs. We are alone out here. We have a crew of 143 people to protect, and we pass through genuinely dangerous territory every week." She held the visor's dark gaze. "I'm not asking you to join Starfleet. I'm asking whether we can help each other." The silence lasted long enough that Chakotay, stoic, patient Chakotay, shifted his weight slightly. "You said you've been out here 3 years, Samus said finally. "Yes." "You're still alive." "We are." "Then you know this region." A pause. "Tell me about the hunters." Janeway tilted her head. "T, the Hirogen?" The slight tension that moved through Samus's frame was not fear. It was the focused attention of a predator hearing another predator's name, the involuntary recalibration of someone updating their threat assessment in real time. "We've had significant contact," Janeway said carefully. "They're a nomadic species. Their entire culture is built around the hunt. They pursue prey across vast distances, sometimes for years. They prize the challenge above the kill. The more formidable the quarry, the greater the honor." She paused, watching the visor. "I'm going to tell you something that you should probably know before we go any further." "Go ahead." "Your arrival through that rift generated an energy signature that was visible on sensors across a considerable range." Janeway kept her voice even. "Hutch, we've been scanning for responses since we pulled you aboard." She looked at the spatial map, then back at Samus. 4 Hirogen vessels have changed course in the last 90 minutes. They're all moving toward our position. The arm cannon cycled, a soft mechanical sound, a readiness that was clearly automatic, a reflex as natural as breathing. They're not coming for your ship, Samus said. No, Janeway agreed. I don't believe they are. Samus looked at the map for a long moment. When she turned back to Janeway, something had settled in her posture. Not resignation, but a kind of grim clarity that the captain recognized. It was the look of someone who had been found before. Someone who had learned what it meant to be the thing being hunted rather than the hunter, and had made their peace with what that required of them. To your crew, Samus said. Can they fight? Janeway allowed herself a small, tired smile. Ms. Aran, she said, you have no idea. The Hirogen did not hurry. That was the thing Janeway had learned to find most unsettling about them. Not their size, not their weaponry, not the trophy rooms aboard their vessels lined with the preserved remains of species from across the quadrant. It was the patience. A human predator in pursuit moved with urgency, with the biological pressure of hunger or fear or ambition. The Hirogen moved the way geological time moved, with the absolute confidence of something that had never once considered the possibility of failure. They had been hunting across the Delta Quadrant for 100,000 years. The concept of their quarry escaping was not something their culture had developed language for, because it had not historically required it. 4 vessels. Janeway had them on the main view screen now. Their approach vectors plotted in red against the starfield, each ship running the distinctive angular profile of Hirogen design. Built for pursuit, for the long chase, for closing distances that would have taken lesser ships generations. They were still outside weapons range. They were not rushing. They were doing what apex predators did when they had already decided the outcome. They were savoring the approach. They're hailing us, Tuvok reported from Tactical. On screen. The Alpha came through on visual, filling the view screen with a particular commanding presence that Hirogen leadership carried like a physical weight. He was larger than most of his species, and most of his species were already large. His ceremonial armor marked with trophies at the shoulder and neck, a record of hunts that stretched back further than Janeway wanted to calculate. He looked at her the way a craftsman looked at a familiar tool, with acknowledgement, with mild respect, with zero interest. His eyes moved past her immediately. Samus stood at the back of the bridge, where Janeway had quietly positioned her before opening the channel. Visible, but not centered. The Alpha found her in approximately 1 second. His expression didn't change, but something in his bearing did. A subtle shift, like a held breath, like a musician recognizing a piece they had been searching for. Captain Janeway, he said. His universal translator handled the language with the flat precision it always used for Hirogen. You have something that does not belong to you. She's a guest aboard my ship, Janeway said, not property. She is prey. He said it without cruelty, without malice. The way one might say she is tall or she is breathing. A simple categorization. We detected her emergence from the transit anomaly. The energy signature of her armor is unlike anything recorded in our neural archives. Her biology carries markers we have never encountered. The faintest inflection entered his voice, something almost reverent. She is worthy. We will have her. You'll have a diplomatic incident, Janeway said. We've spoken before about Voyager's crew being off limits for your hunts. Your crew, yes. We have honored that boundary. However distasteful, his gaze hadn't left Samus. She is not your crew. She is not of your people. She arrived from outside this continuum. She falls under no protection you can offer. A pause. Stand aside, Captain. We have no quarrel with Voyager today. Janeway held the channel open for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary, just long enough to make clear that closing it was her choice, then cut the feed. She turned. Samus had watched the entire exchange without moving. Without the visor's expressiveness to read, Janeway had learned in the past 3 hours to watch the rest of her. The angle of her stance, the positioning of her hands, the almost imperceptible micro-adjustments of the arm cannon that seemed to correlate with her attention. Right now, every signal said the same thing. Assessing. They'll wait until we drop shields for any reason, Samus said. Power transfer, shuttle launch, system maintenance. They'll time it. That's consistent with their tactics, Tuvok confirmed from Tactical, which meant yes, that's exactly what they'll do in Tuvok's characteristic economy of alarm. Then we don't give them a window, Tom Paris said from the helm, with the reflexive confidence of someone who had navigated worse. He caught Chakotay's look. I'm just saying. Samus moved to the view screen, studying the 4 approach vectors with the focused attention she'd given the star map in sickbay. She had a way of reading spatial data that Janeway recognized. The habit of someone who had spent years navigating unfamiliar terrain, Ikor who had trained themselves to extract tactical meaning from geography the way a reader extracted meaning from text. 4 ships, she said. Split formation. 2 will push toward engagement, while 2 hang back. The back pair are the actual threat. They'll use the forward pair to measure response time and shield geometry. She glanced at Tuvok. Your weapons. Phaser arrays, photon torpedoes, a limited complement of transphasic, stopping power at range, significant. Against hydrogen hull plating, effective, but not immediately decisive. Several direct hits would be required to... Then we don't fight at range. She turned back to the view screen. They're expecting a ship that defends itself from inside. Static target. Well, they've been watching you do it for 3 years. The arm cannons shifted with the deliberateness of someone making a decision. I go outside. The bridge went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when someone said something that was simultaneously tactically sound and deeply alarming. Outside, Paris repeated. Their targeting systems are calibrated for vessel-scale threats. I'm small enough to fall below the threshold of their automated point defense. I can reach the rear ships before the forward pair realizes what's happening. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without the self-consciousness of someone asking permission. I've operated in vacuum before. The suit handles it. I have no doubt the suit handles it, Janeway said. Now, what I'm less certain about is whether the Hirogen Alpha's patience handles it. If you engage their ships directly, he'll respect it, Samus said. Not arrogance. Certainty born from understanding a particular kind of adversary. Hirogen culture elevates the hunt. A prey that turns and attacks their ships isn't breaking the rules. It's fulfilling them. He'll pull the forward pair back and come himself. She paused. That's what we want. 4 ships become 1. Your odds improve significantly. Chakotay leaned toward Janeway. She's right about the tactical logic, he said quietly. She's right about all of it, Janeway said, equally quiet. That's not what concerns me. She looked at Samus. What concerns me is what it costs you. The visor regarded her. Something passed through the stillness. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, the small internal adjustment of someone encountering a response they hadn't modeled. The suit's shields will handle the initial weapons discharge, Samus said, and there was something slightly different in her voice now. Not warmer, but more precise, as if she were choosing words more carefully than before. After that, speed and the element of surprise are sufficient. And if they're not, a pause, then your odds still improve. Janeway studied her for a long moment. The armor, the cannon, the absolute self-possession of someone who had made this calculation so many times it had become something close to reflex. She thought about the Alpha's eyes finding Samus before finding anything else on the bridge. She thought about what 100,000 years of hunting culture recognized when it saw something truly worthy. She thought about the fact that the Hirogen had never once encountered a bounty hunter who hunted things that wiped out civilizations for sport. Tom, she said, adjust our shield rotation to cover a gap on the ventral hull. Tuvok, prepare to target the forward pair the moment Samus clears the hull. Harry, she glanced at Kim, open a suit-to-bridge comm frequency. I want to hear her. Captain? Kim looked uncertain. I want her to hear us too. She turned back to Samus. You're not alone out here, Ms. Aran. Not today. The arm cannon powered up with a sound like a gathering storm. Samus moved toward the turbolift without ceremony and without theater, the focused inevitability of someone whose entire existence had prepared them for exactly this kind of moment. Tell your engineer to look at my ship's forward thruster array, she said as the doors opened. She'll find the access panel on the port side. The cipher is 1247. She was gone before Janeway could answer. On the view screen, the 4 Hirogen vessels continued their patient, inevitable approach, closing the distance with the unhurried confidence of a species that had never learned to doubt the outcome. In the void between the ships, something small and orange detached from Voyager's hull and moved toward them at a speed that made Harry Kim's console chirp in surprise. The hunt, for the first time in a very long time, had no idea what was coming. See Section 4. The Hirogen Alpha pulled his forward pair back within 40 seconds. Janeway watched it happen from the bridge, with the particular satisfaction of a theory proving correct. Though satisfaction was perhaps too comfortable a word for what she actually felt, which was something closer to awe with an edge of unease. Samus had crossed the distance to the nearest vessel in the time it took Harry Kim to confirm her suit's comm channel was open. The forward ship's point defense systems fired twice. Two bright pulses of directed energy that should have, by any reasonable calculation, ended the engagement immediately. And tracked nothing, because Samus was no longer where she had been when they fired. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a battle. A battle implied two parties exchanging force in roughly equivalent measure. What Samus did to the first Hirogen vessel's exterior sensor array and weapons emplacements was closer to surgery. Precise, rapid, and total. She moved across the hull with a familiarity that suggested she had done this on structures far more hostile than a Hirogen hunter ship, burning out systems with focus blasts from her arm cannon, avoiding the automated point defense with adjustments so small and so fast that Voyager's own targeting computer, which Tuvok had tasked with tracking her as a precaution, kept losing her. The Alpha hailed them again at the 50-second mark. He did not look angry. He looked the way Janeway had seen him look exactly once before, during their most complicated prior encounter, genuinely engaged. Alive in a way the Hirogens seemed to be only when the hunt had risen to meet them. "Call her back," he said. "We will speak." Janeway called her back. The negotiation was brief and characteristically lopsided. Janeway trading on the Alpha's evident fascination with Samus, the way she traded on every asset available to her out here, which was to say completely and without apology. The Hirogen wanted the hunt. Samus had denied them it, not by fleeing, not by hiding behind Voyager's shields, but by demonstrating in 50 seconds that their forward pair was tactically irrelevant. The cultural calculus was precise. A prey that neutralized your hunters without destroying them had not beaten you. It had elevated the challenge. The Alpha agreed to a period of non-engagement. Janeway suspected it would last precisely as long as the Alpha needed to recalibrate his approach, which bought them time rather than safety. But time was the currency she had learned to value most out here. The moment the channel closed, she exhaled. "She terrifies me a little," Tom Paris said from the helm. "Mr. Paris," Tuvok said, "that is arguably the most tactically sound observation you have made this week." Samus returned to the ship without ceremony, materializing back through the ventral airlock with vacuum frost still crystallizing across the suit's shoulder plating. B'Elanna Torres was waiting in the corridor outside the shuttle bay, having spent the preceding 40 minutes in Samus's ship with an expression that Janeway, observing through the internal sensors, had identified as the specific look B'Elanna wore when she encountered engineering so far beyond her current framework that she couldn't decide whether to be frustrated or delighted. Delighted was winning. "Under the forward thruster array," B'Elanna said, falling into step beside Samus with a complete disregard for personal space that characterized her approach to both engineering problems and people. "The fuel conversion ratio is... I don't even have a unit for what you're running. It's not antimatter. It's not anything in our database. What is it?" "Fuel rods synthesized from phazon-adjacent compounds," Samus said. "Chozo-engineered energy source. Highly stable under controlled conditions." "And under uncontrolled conditions?" "Catastrophic." B'Elanna smiled the smile of an engineer who had spent 3 years keeping a ship running on improvisation and stubbornness. "I like her," she said to no one in particular, then peeled off toward engineering with a PADD full of notes and a new project. Samus continued toward sickbay, where Janeway had asked 7 of 9 to meet them. 7 was already there. She stood beside the secondary console with her hands clasped behind her back. The posture she adopted when she was being patient with a situation she found beneath her processing speed, which was most situations. She had spent the hours of the Hirogen encounter running analysis on the sensor data from Samus's suit, the ship's power readings, and the biological scans the doctor had managed before being firmly told to stop. The results were arranged on the console beside her with the organizational precision that was, for Seven, the equivalent of emotional investment. She did not offer a greeting. She looked at Samus the way she looked at most things, with the unsentimental assessment of someone for whom social performance was an acquired and imperfect skill. "You have been fighting the Borg," Seven said. Samus stopped. "I've never heard that name." "Not the Borg specifically." Seven turned to the console, pulling up a side-by-side comparison that the doctor leaned over to examine with professional curiosity. But something structurally identical in philosophy and methodology, a collective intelligence. It assimilates biological organisms and technology. It seeks to eliminate individual identity in favor of unified consciousness. It expands without mercy or negotiation, driven by a directive to achieve perfection through absorption. She looked back at Samus. "Your suit's combat data, the burn patterns on its plating, the specific frequency adaptations in your beam weapons, the targeting algorithms encoded in your visor's combat memory, all of it reflects sustained warfare against an enemy that adapts to individual attacks, that uses a hive structure, that sends biological technological hybrid organisms as its primary combatants." A pause. "In your universe, what do you call them?" Samus was quiet for a moment. "The Phazon network," she said. "The things it creates. Metroids. Modified organisms. Controlled through a central intelligence?" Something shifted in her voice. The first time since her arrival that it had carried anything beneath its operational flatness. Something old. "I've been fighting them for most of my life." Seven absorbed this without visible reaction. Then she pulled up a third display. Borg tactical data, drone schematics, assimilation protocols. "Ash, then you understand what we face," she said. "And you understand that your methods—" She indicated the suit's combat history with a precise gesture. "Are effective in ways that Starfleet's engagement protocols are not." Another pause, this one carrying weight. "You destroy them, completely, without attempting communication, without offering terms, without seeking understanding." She held Samus's gaze through the visor. "Captain Janeway has spent considerable effort attempting to find alternatives to that approach. I have watched her succeed. I have watched her fail." The faintest inflection entered Seven's voice. Not quite emotion, but the ghost of it, the shape emotion left behind when it had been partially unlearned. "I was Borg for 18 years. I know what they are. And I know what your methods mean." "They're necessary," Samus said. "Yes," Seven said. And that was the part that silenced the room. Not the word, but the way she said it. Without argument, without the qualifications Janeway would have attached, the ethical architecture Chakotay would have constructed around it. Just the flat, precise agreement of someone who had been inside the thing, being discussed and carried the knowledge of it in every reconstructed cell. The doctor looked between them and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Janeway stood in the doorway. She had arrived midway through the exchange without announcing herself, an old habit, and watched the two of them in the console's blue light, the former drone and the bounty hunter, both shaped by wars against things that consumed. Both carrying the damage of it in different registers. Seven in the visible Borg implants and the careful reconstruction of her personhood. Samus in the armor she hadn't removed once since arriving, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was safer than being known. "Seven," Janeway said quietly. "What else did you find?" Seven turned back to the console. Her expression, which had briefly carried something unguarded, resettled into its professional geometry. "The Chozo technology in her suit," she said, "contains energy signatures I have encountered in only one other context." She brought up a new display, deep space telemetry, a region of the Delta Quadrant several weeks ahead of Voyager's current course. A cluster of readings that the long-range sensors had flagged and filed, and which no one had prioritized, because there was always something more immediately threatening to prioritize. "Here," Seven said. Samus looked at the display for a long time. "That's not possible," she said very quietly. "No," Seven agreed. And yet, outside, the stars continued their patient indifference. Somewhere behind them, at a respectful but deliberate distance, 4 Hirogen vessels maintained their course, patient, recalibrating, waiting for the hunt to resume on terms that honored what they had seen. Janeway looked at the display, then at Samus, and felt the specific sensation she had learned to associate with the Delta Quadrant's particular brand of complication. The recognition that the situation she understood had just become the surface of a situation she didn't. She was going to need more coffee. The planet didn't have a name in any Federation database. It existed in Voyager's navigational charts as a string of coordinates and a brief automated notation. Class M, pre-warp civilization, estimated population 400 million, recommend course adjustment to maintain non-detection threshold. The kind of entry that accumulated quietly in the ship's logs, the way sediment accumulated at a river's bottom, layer by layer, unexamined. They had passed within sensor range 3 days ago during the Hirogen standoff and filed it without discussion. Who, because discussion would have led somewhere Janeway wasn't ready to go, while managing 4 hunter vessels and an interdimensional bounty hunter with Chozo technology in her bloodstream. The planet had not returned the courtesy of remaining unexamined. Tuvok brought it to her attention at 0612 hours with the precise, unhurried delivery he reserved for situations that were already beyond the point where hurrying helped. 2 Hirogen vessels, not the 4 they'd been tracking, which meant the Alpha had dispatched a separate hunting party while maintaining his observed non-engagement agreement with Voyager, with the particular technical honesty of someone who understood the letter of a negotiation rather than its spirit, had broken orbit around the unnamed planet 40 minutes earlier. Long-range sensors showed what they had left behind. Yamwa village, pre-industrial, stone construction, agricultural. Approximately 300 individuals before the Hirogen arrived. The thermal signatures now were different in number and in kind. Janeway was on the bridge in 2 minutes. How many, she asked. Tuvok didn't soften it. Current life sign count within the village boundary is consistent with a reduction of roughly 60 individuals. The Hirogen vessels departed on a heading that suggests they are repositioning for a secondary approach. They're coming back, Chakotay said. The hunt is ongoing, Tuvok confirmed. In all, the village represents active quarry. Janeway stood at the center of the bridge and felt the weight she always felt in these moments. The weight that the Prime Directive was designed to redistribute into principle so that individual captains didn't have to carry it personally. It never actually worked that way. The principle existed in the abstract. The 60 people existed in the specific, and the specific always had more gravity. Captain, Kim's voice was careful. Samus is in the shuttle bay. She's been in there since 0400. I think she's been monitoring our sensors. Janeway closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. Put me on ship wide. She was too late by 11 minutes. Not because she had hesitated. She had moved quickly, made her decision. It begun the calculus of how to intervene in a way that minimized cultural contamination while preventing a massacre. The Prime Directive was not absolute for Janeway. It never had been. It was a principle she carried honestly and violated only when the honest weight of a specific situation demanded it. She had been building the case, section by section, the way she always did. Not looking for permission, but for coherence, for the version of the choice she could defend to herself afterward. Samus hadn't waited for a case to be built. The shuttle bay door showed an unauthorized atmospheric vent at 0619, a gap in the external hull just large enough for a figure in a power suit to exit without triggering a full launch alert, if that figure knew exactly where to apply pressure to a ventral maintenance seal. B'Elanna, reviewing the logs 40 minutes later, would express simultaneous fury and admiration at the precision of it. Samus had been in the ship's systems just long enough to find the gap and use it, not long enough to leave any other trace. When Voyager dropped to transporter range of the planet and Janeway hailed the surface to assess the situation, the Hirogen hunting party was already neutralized, not killed. That was the first thing she established, scanning the sensor readings with the focused attention of someone who needed that specific data point before anything else. The 4 Hirogen hunters were alive, unconscious, disarmed, their weapons reduced to non-functional components, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had done this before. Their ship in low orbit had been similarly addressed. Propulsion offline, aim weapons offline, Communications reduced to short range only. Sufficient to call for help. Insufficient to finish a hunt. Samus was standing at the edge of the village when Janeway beamed down. The village itself, Janeway took it in quickly, the way she took in every new civilization. The architecture, the agricultural patterns visible in the surrounding fields, the style of clothing on the figures who had gathered at a cautious distance and were watching the armored stranger with an expression caught precisely between terror and something that hadn't yet decided whether it was awe or worship. Children at the back of the crowd, held by adults. Elders at the front, because elders always move to the front. This was a people who had never seen a spaceship, who had no framework for what they had just experienced. Hunters descending from the sky, then a different figure descending from the sky. The hunters rendered harmless in minutes by methods that bore no relationship to anything in their understanding of the world. Samus stood at the village's edge and had not entered it. That was the detail Janeway fixed on first. She had stopped at the boundary, a low stone wall, agricultural in function, meaningless as a tactical barrier, and had not crossed it. The Hirogen were dealt with. The threat was neutralized. She had done what she came to do and then stopped, and the stopping had a precision to it that told Janeway it was deliberate. She crossed the distance between them and kept her voice low. "Oh, you accessed my ship's systems. Maintenance seal on the ventral. I know where you went out." Janeway held her gaze. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that you did it without authorization." A pause. "Yes. And that 60 people are dead because of a Hirogen hunt you interrupted after the fact." The visor turned toward the village. Something in Samus's bearing shifted. Not guilt exactly, but the particular weight of someone who had calculated an outcome, arrived too late for part of it, and was carrying the arithmetic of that. "I was monitoring your sensor," she said. "When I saw the thermal signatures change, I made a decision." "You made my decision," Janeway said. "This crew, this ship, we have protocols. Your protocols would have put 60 more people in the ground while you built a case." Not aggressive, not apologetic. The flat, honest delivery of someone reporting what they believe to be true. "I've seen what happens to pre-warp civilizations when something from above comes for them and nothing comes back. I've stood in the ruins." Something in her voice barely present, like a structural element glimpsed through a wall. "I won't stand at the edge of that and wait for paperwork." The silence between them had weight. Janeway was aware of the villagers watching, aware of Chakotay, who had beamed down 30 seconds after her, standing at a careful distance and letting this conversation be what it needed to be. Aware of the larger man at the front of the gathered crowd, an elder, scarred, his eyes moving between Janeway and Samus with the particular intelligence of someone who had survived a long time by reading situations accurately. She was also aware that Samus was right about the timeline. That was the part she had to sit with. The honest, uncomfortable acknowledgement that the 11 minutes it would have taken to build the case, to satisfy the principle, would have cost something real and specific and irreversible. The prime directive existed to prevent interference. It could not account for the Hirogen, who were already interfering, who had been interfering for 100,000 years across this quadrant, who regarded civilizations like this one as terrain rather than people. "The cultural contamination," Janeway said quietly. "These people saw you. They saw your suit, your weapons. That doesn't disappear." "No," Samus agreed. "It doesn't. They'll build stories around this. Myths, possibly." She, the armored figure who came from the sky and drove away the sky hunters. She looked at the crowd, at the elder, at the children peering around adult legs with enormous eyes. That changes them. It changes what they believe about the universe, about whether they're alone in it, about what protection looks like. That's not a small thing. "It isn't," Samus said, "but they're alive to be changed by it." Janeway looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the village, at the stone walls and the agricultural fields and the people who had woken up this morning inside a cosmology that was about to become permanently larger. She thought about every version of this conversation she'd had with herself across 3 years and 70,000 light years. She thought about every time the principle had held and every time she had chosen the specific over the abstract and lived with both choices with equal honesty. She thought about Samus standing at the boundary of the village, and not crossing it. Doing the thing she came to do, and then stopping. You could have gone in, she said. After. They wouldn't have stopped you. I know, Samus said. Why didn't you? The visor looked at the crowd, at the elder, at the children. Because it wasn't my village to walk through, Samus said. I did what was necessary. The rest belongs to them. Janeway was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Chakotay. Get a medical team down here. Discreet equipment. No uniforms if possible. She looked back at Samus. We're going to help them bury their dead. Then we're going to leave. And then we're going to do it in a way that gives their storytellers the best possible raw material. She started toward the elder, then stopped. We'll discuss the unauthorized hull exit when we're back on the ship, she said. I know, Samus said again. I'm going to be very thorough about it. I expected that. Janeway almost smiled. She walked toward the elder instead, hands open, the universal language of someone arriving without weapons and without agenda. The oldest diplomatic tool in any universe. Behind her, at the boundary wall, Samus watched and did not follow. The cube dropped out of warp without warning. That was always the thing about the Borg. They didn't announce themselves the way other threats did. The Hirogen sent vessels on visible approach vectors. Yes, the Kazan hailed before they attacked because their aggression had theater in it. Even species 8472 moved with a biological urgency that sensors could track. The Borg simply arrived the way a mathematical conclusion arrived. Not with drama, but with inevitability. One moment Voyager's long-range sensors showed clear space ahead. The next moment they showed a cube measuring 3 kilometers on each side. And the difference between those two sensor states was not a transition, but a fact. General quarters sounded before Janeway reached the bridge. The cube was not moving. That was the second thing. It sat in their path like a problem waiting to be solved. Running lights cycling through the deep green that made Voyager's bridge look like something submerged. And it made no aggressive maneuver, sent no cutting beam. Ion initiated no assimilation sequence. It simply occupied the space ahead of them with the patient implacability of something that had decided waiting was sufficient. Red alert, Janeway said, which was technically redundant given the klaxons, but which she said anyway because saying it was part of how she arrived fully in command mode. Tuvok, shields. Tom, come about to heading 27 Mark III. Give us some distance. Harry, are they hailing us? Not yet, Kim said, but they're scanning us. Deep scan. The kind they usually run right before the hail came through. Not the standard Borg transmission, not the layered plural voice of the collective speaking in unified monotone. The we are the Borg, you will be assimilated, resistance is futile that had entered Federation culture as the definition of existential dread. One, this was different. Single voice, precise, carrying the collective's intelligence through individual architecture the way 7 of 9 carried it. The Borg's consciousness processed through a filtered lens. The drone on the view screen was not standard configuration. Its assimilation technology was present. Tubules at the wrist, cranial implants, the characteristic gray-pale skin of someone whose biology had been redistributed toward function. But its bearing had a quality that 7, standing at the secondary console, identified with visible tension in the set of her jaw. Tactical drone, she said quietly, high-ranking, decision-making authority. Captain Janeway of Voyager, the drone said, we do not seek your vessel today. That's a comfort, Janeway said. What do you seek? You carry an organism of significant interest to the collective. The drone's single organic eye, pale blue, the blue of something that had once been something else, moved with mechanical precision to 7, and then, with a shift that was almost unhurried, past her. The organism designated Samus Aran. Her biological structure contains chozo-genetic encoding at a cellular level. Her technology integrates biological and mechanical systems through methods the collective has not encountered in 300 years of assimilation across this quadrant. A pause. 312 years ago, we assimilated a chozo scouting vessel in grid 614. The technology aboard was unlike anything in our database at that time. We adapted, we improved, but the source remained incomplete. The pale eye steadied. Mom, she is the completion. Janeway kept her voice level. She's not available for assimilation. All things are available for assimilation. Not on my ship. The drone's expression, if it could be called that, the remnant of musculature around the eye that hadn't been entirely redistributed, shifted in a way that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite dismissal. You have resisted the collective before, Captain Janeway. We have adapted to your resistance. We have adapted to your weapons modifications, your shield rotations, your transphasic torpedoes. A pause. We have not yet adapted to what she carries. The channel closed. Janeway turned. 7. They're not lying, 7 said. The flatness in her voice had a specific quality. The flatness of someone applying enormous control to something that wanted to be something else. The collective's memory of the Chozo vessel is genuine. What they assimilated 300 years ago, I can feel the edge of it in my own residual connection to the hive. A fragment, something they incorporated and could not fully process. Like a sentence in a language they partially learned and cannot complete. She looked at Samus. You are the rest of the sentence. Samus had been standing at the back of the bridge since general quarters sounded, in the position she always chose. Maximum sight lines, minimum exposure, the habitual geometry of someone who had navigated hostile environments so long it had become spatial instinct. She was looking at the cube on the view screen with the focused attention she gave all threats. Hey, but there was something underneath it. Something that the combination of Seven's words and the drone's mention of the Chozo scouting vessel had introduced into her bearing, a new variable she was running calculations on. 300 years ago, she said. In this quadrant's timeline, yes, Seven said. The Chozo didn't have scouting vessels in this region, not by that designation. She looked at Seven. Exploratory missions, preservation teams, the Chozo documented civilizations before? She stopped. The arm cannon made its readiness sound without any visible, deliberate movement, a reflex operating beneath conscious control. Before what happened to them? The bridge was quiet. Janeway watched Samus with the attention she gave every moment when a new dimension of a situation revealed itself. When the thing she thought she understood turned out to have been the visible surface of something much larger. What happened to the Chozo? She asked. Samus looked at the cube, then at Janeway. Something found them, she said. Something that moved through their civilization the way the Borg moved through civilizations. Not identical. The mechanism was different. But the philosophy... She stopped again, and the stopping had a quality that the Samus Janeway had come to know over the past days didn't usually permit. A quality of weight. The Phazon network, the Metroids, the space pirates who learned to weaponize both. They didn't arise independently. They were symptoms of something older, of something that was using them the way the Borg used drones. She looked at Seven. Your collective assimilated a Chozo team that was out here documenting it, looking for its origin. Seven was very still. The fragment, she said, in the collective's memory, the thing they could not fully process. She turned to the console, pulling up data with rapid precision, her fingers moving across the display with the urgency of someone whose architecture allowed them to think faster than they could speak. I always interpreted it as a gap, something the collective incorporated and found structurally incompatible, quarantined within the hive mind. But if it's not a gap, if it's a key... Seven. Janeway's voice was steady. What are you accessing? My residual connection to the collective, Seven said. Controlled, targeted. And I am not allowing reciprocal access. She didn't look up. The fragment is coordinates, not spatial, temporal. The Chozo team was documenting something, and they encoded what they found in a format the Borg could assimilate but not read, because reading it required Chozo biological keys. She stopped. Her hands were still on the console. Captain, the thing the Chozo were documenting in this quadrant 300 years ago, it is still here. The cube had not moved. 3 kilometers of Borg architecture sitting in the space ahead of them, patient as mathematics, waiting for the outcome of a conversation it had initiated and was monitoring through means that Voyager's ECM was doing its best and insufficient work to block. Janeway turned to Tuvok. Tactical options. Limited, Tuvok said, with the precision of someone who had prepared this assessment and did not enjoy delivering it. The cube's shielding is adaptive to our current weapon configurations. Our transphasic complement is insufficient for a vessel of this scale. We can damage it. We cannot destroy it. Conventional evasion. They'll match any course change before we can execute it, Tom said from the helm. He wasn't being defeatist. He was being accurate. And in Tom Paris's voice, those two things occupied entirely different registers. Samus was looking at the cube with an expression Janeway couldn't read through the visor, but could feel in the quality of the silence around her. I can get inside it, Samus said. Absolutely not, Janeway said. They want what I carry. If I go in voluntarily, they'll assimilate you. They'll try. The arm cannon powered to full readiness. Not a threat display, a status report. The suit's energy field has resisted assimilation technology before. Not Borg specifically, but the underlying mechanism is similar enough that I have data on it. She looked at Janeway. I can access the fragment 7 described, the coordinates, whatever the Chozo team found. And if the suit's field fails, a pause, then you have the data from my suit's external logs, and you know where to look. That's not an acceptable outcome. It's an acceptable risk. Samus held her gaze. Captain, whatever is still out here, whatever the Chozo were documenting when the Borg found their team, it's on a heading with your ship, with your 143 people, zoning in a quadrant where you have no backup and no exit. The visor tracked to the cube, then back. I've been hunting things like this my entire life. I know what it costs to go in without intelligence. I know what it costs more to go in without it. The bridge held its breath. Janeway looked at 7. Can you monitor her from here? Maintain a targeted scan that tracks her biosigns and suit telemetry inside the cube's interference? 7 calculated for 2 seconds. Partially. The collective's shielding will degrade the signal. I can maintain intermittent contact. Intermittent, Janeway repeated. Yes. Janeway looked at the cube, then at Samus, then at the rest of her bridge crew, Tom's carefully neutral expression, Harry's poorly concealed alarm, Tuvok's absolute stillness, Chakotay's measured assessment, and she thought about what the drone had said, the completion. 300 years of an incomplete sentence sitting in the collective's vast and terrible memory, waiting for the biological key that could finish it. She thought about what Samus had said. Something found them. You go in, you get the coordinates, and you get out, she said. The moment your biosigns show assimilation activity, I am firing every weapon this ship has at that cube and pulling you out on a transporter lock regardless of what the interference does to the signal. Understood. And Samus. Janeway held her gaze. You come back. It was not a tactical instruction. It was something else. The specific, unguarded thing that happened after days of shared impossible situations when professional distance became insufficient to describe what was actually happening. Samus looked at her for a moment. I intend to, she said. It was, Janeway reflected, probably the most honest thing anyone had said to her all week. The turbolift closed. The cube waited, patient and luminous in the view screen's frame. Green light washing the bridge in the color of something that had consumed 1,000 civilizations and was prepared to wait as long as necessary to consume one more. Harry, Janeway said quietly, keep that transporter lock warm. Already on it, Captain, Kim said. Outside, something small and orange moved toward the cube. Deliberate, unescorted, carrying in its cells and its technology the answer to a question 300 years old. Moving toward the thing that wanted to take it with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never yet found a darkness they could not walk back out of. When the collective waited, Samus kept moving. The cube swallowed her without resistance. That was the first wrong thing. Samus had approached the Borg's outer hull expecting point defense, automated countermeasures, the mechanical hostility of a structure that treated all unauthorized entry as an assimilation opportunity. Instead, the hull simply opened. Not in the way a door opened, with the logic of a mechanism designed for passage, but in the way a living thing opened around something it intended to incorporate. A slow, deliberate parting of hull plating that closed behind her the moment she was through, sealing with a sound like something satisfied. The suit registered the closure. She registered it. She kept moving. Inside, the cube was what she understood a Borg vessel to be from Seven's briefings and her own rapid analysis of the collective's tactical drone. Functional, vast, indifferent to aesthetics, in the way that organisms optimize entirely for purpose, were indifferent to aesthetics. Corridors without the concept of corridors, just pathways between machinery. Lighting that existed because certain processes required it and nowhere else. The deep subsonic hum of systems running at scales that made the air itself feel occupied, like standing inside something breathing. Drones moved through the space with the coordinated purposelessness of a hive. Not going anywhere exactly, just maintaining the collective's distributed body the way blood cells maintain an organism without any individual cell understanding the whole. None of them moved toward her, and that was the second wrong thing. The suit's scan visor was running continuous analysis, painting the space in tactical overlays. Drone positions, power conduit locations, the structural geometry of the cube's interior mapped in amber lines against the green-lit darkness. The biological readings were what she focused on. The drones carried the specific signature of assimilated organic material. The baseline humanoid biology of 100 species rewritten toward function. The Borg's particular brand of coexistence between flesh and machine that Seven had described not as synthesis, but as consumption. Each drone was the remainder of a person, the part that could be used. She had fought the Phazon network long enough to recognize what looking at the remainder of a person felt like. She moved deeper. The suit's internal comm channel to Voyager was already degrading. Seven had predicted this, and the intermittent quality of it, the way Janeway's voice came through in fragments with static filling the gaps, was the most disorienting aspect of the cube's interior. Not the drones, not the scale, the specific erosion of the voice telling her she wasn't alone. Readings are holding. Signal is, Samus, can you? Receiving intermittently, she said. Moving toward the power signature Seven identified. Drones are not engaging. That concerns me more than static, than silence. She kept moving. The coordinates Seven had pulled from her residual collective connection led toward the cube's central plexus, the approximate equivalent of a command center, though the Borg's distributed intelligence made the concept imprecise. Seven had described it as the place where the cube's local processing concentrated, where the fragment of Chozo memory had been stored in the collective's vast archive with the quarantine markers of something it had incorporated and could not process. 300 years in the hive's memory, a sentence waiting for someone who could read it. What she found instead, 40 meters from the plexus, was Ensign Vorik. The Vulcan engineer had been part of a maintenance team, working in Voyager's secondary hull during the cube's arrival. The wrong place during a general quarters alert, caught outside the ship's interior shielding when the cube's first scan swept through. The transporter had lost him in the interference. Janeway had noted his absence with the controlled precision of a captain accounting for her crew in a crisis. It had filed it in the category of active problem rather than resolved loss, which was its own kind of hope. He was alive, still himself. She could tell the difference, having Seven's briefings fresh and the scan visor's biological analysis running in real time. The assimilation process had been initiated and then stopped. Tubules at his neck, the beginnings of implant architecture at his left temple, but the process incomplete, suspended, as if someone had begun a sentence and paused mid-word. His eyes were open, conscious. The Vulcan control in his expression was doing the work it was designed to do, keeping the situation from becoming something his biology couldn't manage. But underneath it, his biosigns were running with the elevated tension of someone who had been understanding exactly what was happening to them and had been doing so for several hours. She knelt beside him. His eyes found her visor. "Bounty hunter," he said. His voice carried the faint roughness of someone who had been screaming at some point and had decided to stop. "The crew has mentioned you. Can you move?" He assessed himself with the methodical self-inventory of a Vulcan engineer and a person who had been partially assimilated and was treating the experience as data. Yes, the process was interrupted before significant motor function was affected. I do not know why it was interrupted. "I do," Samus said. She had been looking at the walls while she talked to him. Not at him, at the cube's interior, and at the specific section of the plexus chamber they occupied, because something about the architecture here was different from the rest of the cube. The machinery was older. Not degraded, Borg systems didn't degrade, they adapted, but the underlying structure beneath 3 centuries of Borg modification was built on a geometry she recognized the way she recognized her own suit's schematics. Not intellectually, physically. In the cellular memory the Chozo had written into her. The cube was built on a Chozo foundation, not the whole cube, not the whole Borg. But here, this section, this chamber, the specific architecture that Seven's fragment coordinates had led her to, beneath 300 years of Borg adaptation and modification, and the collective's relentless drive to improve and expand and absorb, us the underlying bones of something else, something that had been here first. The Chozo preservation team hadn't just been documenting something in the Delta Quadrant 300 years ago. They had built something here, a station possibly, a repository. The Borg had assimilated it the way they assimilated everything, incorporated it, modified it, improved it according to their own definition of improvement, and the Chozo architecture had become the cube's architecture, folded into the collective the way a language was folded into a culture that had conquered the civilization that spoke it. Present in the bones, unrecognized. The fragment in the collective's memory wasn't a record of what the Chozo team had found. It was directions to what they had left behind. Her visor found it in the chamber's far wall, a panel, smooth and amber tinted, the specific material composition of Chozo construction, running beneath 3 centuries of Borg surface modification. Dormant, waiting with the patience of engineering designed to outlast the civilization that built it, for the biological key the Chozo always used. The key that was her DNA, her cellular structure, the Chozo encoding that Seven had identified, and the collective's tactical drone had called the completion. They had stopped assimilating Vorik when her biosigns entered the cube. They were waiting for her to open it. She looked at the panel. She looked at Vorik. She looked at the drones moving at the edges of the chamber. Still not engaging, still maintaining their careful, but terrible patience, and understood the architecture of the situation with the tactical clarity that years of hunting had built into her, as surely as the Chozo had built anything else. The collective wanted what was inside the panel. It had been waiting 300 years. It had allowed her into the cube, had suspended Vorik's assimilation as leverage and as demonstration, had guided her here with the coordinates and with Seven's fragment, and with every carefully constructed step of the encounter because it needed her biology to open the thing it had been carrying and could not read for 3 centuries. The moment she opened it, the assimilation attempt would resume. She reached for her comm. Janeway, static, fragments. Then closer than she expected. Here, barely. Twitty, what's your... I need you to do something in exactly 60 seconds. She kept her voice level. Full power to the transporter. 2 locks. My signal and a Vulcan biosign approximately 3 meters from me. When I tell you, pull us both regardless of the interference. Don't wait for clean acquisition. A pause filled with static. Then clear. What are you going to do in 60 seconds? She looked at the panel. At the Chozo engineering beneath the Borg surface. At 300 years of something her people had left in a corner of the universe she had never known existed. Waiting in the dark inside the thing that had consumed its builders. Waiting with the stubborn patience of things designed to endure. I'm going to read the last message my people left out here, she said. She pressed her palm to the panel. The Chozo encoding in her cells met the Chozo engineering in the wall, the way a key met a lock. Not mechanically, but biologically. A recognition between living systems that 3 centuries of Borg adaptation hadn't been able to erase because the collective had never understood what it was carrying well enough to modify it. The panel opened. The data came in a format she had not encountered in any surviving Chozo repository. Dense, ancient, encoded in a dialect of Chozo information architecture that predated the civilization she knew by several thousand years. The visor translated what it could. The rest she absorbed directly, the cellular encoding working as its designers had intended, reading the message at a level below language. The Chozo hadn't been documenting a threat. They had been documenting a convergence. A point in space and time where something they had been tracking across multiple galaxies and multiple centuries would arrive. Not a species, not a weapon, but a condition. A state of entropy that moved through civilizations the way a wave moved through water, using the biology and technology it encountered as amplification. Phazon was one expression of it. The Borg were another, not the same phenomenon, not identical, but resonant. Harmonics of the same fundamental frequency. The Chozo had spent their civilization's final centuries mapping it, trying to understand whether what they were seeing was causation or correlation, whether the thing they were tracking had made the Borg or had simply found them and recognized a useful instrument. The coordinates in the message were precise. The convergence point was 6 weeks ahead of Voyager's current course. The drones moved. She was already running, Vorik on his feet beside her with the efficiency of a Vulcan engineer who had been waiting for a variable to change. His partially assimilated left arm managing function well enough for movement. The assimilation tubules at her neck made contact once. She felt the suit's energy field discharge in response. A sharp pulse that dropped the nearest drone and bought 4 seconds. The arm cannon cleared the corridor ahead with 3 shots. Not lethal, enough. Now, she said into the comm. The transporter took them apart in the green-lit dark of a 300-year-old Chozo message inside a Borg cube, 65,000 light-years from anywhere either of them called home. It had put them back together on Voyager's transporter pad, with the slightly ragged quality of a signal pulled through interference by a chief engineer who had been holding the locks manually and swearing in Klingon for 60 seconds straight. Bilana's voice from the transporter console. I have them. Both of them. They're intact. On the bridge, Janeway said something that was not in the Starfleet officer's handbook. Then, Tom, get us out of here. Maximum warp. The cube did not pursue. It sat in the space behind Voyager's accelerating wake, vast and patient, and 300 years closer to something it had been waiting to complete, its pale green lights cycling through the dark with the steady rhythm of something that had already decided this was not the end of the conversation. In the transporter room, Samus looked at her visor's recorded data, at the coordinates, at the 6-week timeline. She looked at Vorik, who was looking at his partially assimilated left hand with the expression of a Vulcan processing something he intended to be logical about and was not finding entirely cooperative. The doctor will want to see you, she said. Yes, he agreed. He looked at her. Thank you. She said nothing. She was already reading the coordinates again, the Chozo message running through her cellular memory like a second pulse, ancient and specific and terrible in its precision. 6 weeks. Janeway called the senior staff to the briefing room at 1400 hours and laid out what Samus had found inside the cube with the directness she always used when the situation was bad enough that softening it would be its own kind of dishonesty. The coordinates. The 6-week timeline. The Chozo documentation of a convergence point that had been tracking through this region of the Delta Quadrant for centuries, using the civilizations it encountered. The Borg, the Phazon network, the space pirates, everything Samus had spent her life fighting, as instruments rather than ends. Not a species, not a weapon, a condition. A state of entropic collapse that moved through biology and technology the way a current moved through water, and what waited at the convergence point 6 weeks ahead was the place where that current terminated, where it concentrated, where if the Chozo's 3,000-year documentation was accurate, it would achieve something the ancient message had encoded in a word that Samus's visor had translated 4 different ways before settling on the one that fit the context best. When ignition. The briefing room held the word for a moment in the way it held all difficult words, in the particular silence of people who were already doing the mathematics. Ignition of what? Chakotay asked. The Chozo didn't have a precise translation for it, Samus said. She was standing rather than sitting, as she always stood rather than sat, positioned near the viewport with the star field behind her. The closest analogy in their documentation is a chain reaction, something that, once initiated at the convergence point, propagates outward, uses everything the condition has already seeded, the Borg infrastructure, The phase-on contamination in my universe, every civilization it has touched. As a network, she paused. The Chozo estimated the propagation range at approximately one-third of the galaxy. Another silence. Odd longer this time. Both galaxies, Seven said. Not a question. She had been still since the briefing began, her hands flat on the table, her residual Borg connection doing whatever it did when she was processing something at the intersection of her two selves. The condition exists in your universe and in this one. The convergence point is where the two expressions meet. The Borg in this universe, the phase-on network in yours. They are not separate phenomena that happen to resemble each other. They are the same phenomenon operating through dimensional parallels. She looked at Samus. The Chozo understood this. That's why they built the repository inside what became the Borg cube, Samus said. They weren't just documenting, they were building a warning system. Something that would survive long enough to be found by someone who could read it at a time close enough to the convergence to matter. The arm cannon was powered down, a deliberate signal she had adopted in briefings over the past days. A studied concession to the social architecture of a table, where weapons hot meant something different than it did in a corridor. They encoded it in a format that required Chozo biology to access because they knew the Borg would find it eventually. They needed it to survive the assimilation intact until someone like me came along. They planned for you specifically? Tom Paris asked. They planned for whoever they made, Samus said. The Chozo engineered their successors carefully. The biological encoding is genetic. It passes through any Chozo-raised individual. They didn't know my name. They knew what they were building. Janeway had been listening with the focused quiet she brought to the briefings that mattered most, the ones where the shape of the problem was still assembling itself, and premature intervention would close off avenues that needed to stay open. She looked at the star chart Tuvok had pulled up on the briefing room's display, Voyager's course, the convergence coordinates ahead, and the cluster of Hirogen vessel signatures that had been maintaining a parallel track at a respectful distance since the cube's departure, watching, reassessing, updating their calculation of what they were dealing with. 6 weeks, she said. At current warp, we arrive at the convergence coordinates in 5 weeks? 4 days. If we go there, Chakotay said. He wasn't arguing. He was noting the choice, cool the way a good first officer noted choices, with enough emphasis that the captain couldn't mistake it for a given. If we go there, Janeway agreed, discuss. B'Elanna spoke first, the way B'Elanna always spoke, with the directness of someone who had identified the engineering problem and was impatient to get to the part where they solved it. The ship's systems aren't configured for whatever we're flying into. We have no data on what the convergence point looks like physically, what effect it has on warp drive or shields or anything. We're going in blind. We have the Chozo documentation, Seven said. It is incomplete. The data Samus recovered describes the convergence's nature and timeline, but contains limited information about its physical properties at the terminus point. The Chozo team did not reach it. Only they documented from a distance. Because they ran out of time, Samus said. Something in her voice, the specific quality of someone speaking about the end of a civilization they had grown up inside the ruins of. What would it take to not go in blind? Janeway asked. Seven considered this with the processing speed that always made her pauses feel shorter than other people's pauses. Current sensor data from within the convergence zone. Close-range readings of the terminus point's physical and energy properties. If we had that data 6 weeks in advance of arrival, B'Elanna could configure our systems accordingly. She paused. The difficulty is that the only vessels in this region with the range and speed to gather that data ahead of our arrival and return it to us are Hirogen, Tuvok said. The briefing room looked at Janeway. She had already been looking at the Hirogen vessel signatures on the star chart. She had been looking at them since she brought up the display, which was why she had brought up the display. The senior staff recognized this, the specific quality of Janeway having already done the things she was now walking them through, out of respect for the process rather than necessity. The Hirogen Alpha, she said. He's been tracking us since the first encounter. He's seen Samus neutralize his forward pair. He's watched a Borg cube arrive and depart without assimilating us. He's been updating his assessment of what she is for 4 days. She looked at Samus. In Hirogen culture, the most honored hunts are the ones that require genuine partnership. Coalition hunting, when the prey is too significant for a single party. Yeah, they have a term for it. Hakatha, Samus said. She had been reading the Hirogen cultural files Balana had compiled during the first encounter, apparently with the thoroughness of someone who believed that understanding a predator's culture was as important as understanding its weapons. A sanctified hunt, shared, the honor distributed according to contribution rather than hierarchy. You've done your homework. I always do. Janeway stood. I'm going to hail the Alpha and propose a Hakatha. He scouts the convergence zone ahead of our arrival, shares the sensor data, and joins us at the terminus point. She paused. In exchange, he gets the most significant hunt of his culture's history, shared with prey significant enough to elevate his legacy permanently. She looked at the table. Objections. It's manipulative, Chakotay said. Yes. And it gives an apex predator advanced knowledge of our destination and timeline. Also yes. And if he decides the Hakatha is a convenient fiction and simply ambushes us at the convergence point, then we have a Hirogen problem on top of a civilization-ending convergence problem, Janeway said, and we deal with it in sequence. She looked at him steadily. I know the risks, Chakotay. I'm asking if there's a better option. He held her gaze for a moment, then settled back. No. She looked at Samus. He'll want you involved in the proposal. He's been tracking you specifically. The Hikatha framing only works if you're part of the offer. If you're hunting alongside him rather than functioning as the prey he's been assigned. Samus looked at the star chart, at the convergence coordinates, at the 6-week window between now and something the Chozo had spent their civilization's final centuries documenting and had not survived long enough to stop. I've worked with worse partners, she said. The Alpha received them in his vessel's trophy hall, which was deliberate, a demonstration of context, of history, of what the Hirogen were and had always been. The room stretched the length of the ship's central corridor, and it was precisely what Seven's briefing materials had described. Preserved remains of species from across the quadrant, mounted and cataloged with the care of a museum dedicated to a single subject. The Hirogen's greatest hunts, their cultural memory made physical. The Alpha stood at its center and watched them enter with the expression he always wore. Absolute attention, held perfectly still, every calculation running beneath a surface that revealed nothing except presence. Janeway had brought Samus and Tuvok. The minimal configuration, enough to demonstrate respect, not enough to suggest threat. She made the proposal with the directness she had found worked best with the Hirogen, because their culture had no patience for indirection and considerable patience for honesty delivered without flinching. The Alpha listened without interrupting. He looked at Samus twice during the proposal. Not at Janeway, at Samus, with the assessing focus he had shown since the first hail. When Janeway finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The prey you describe, he said slowly. This convergence, it is not a living thing. Not in the conventional sense, Janeway said. But the Chozo documentation describes emergent behavior, response to resistance, adaptation to countermeasures. Whether it constitutes life by your definition or mine is a question we may not have time to settle philosophically. And if it is not alive, the hunt has no honor. He looked at Samus. This is a warrior's concern, not a captain's. His gaze didn't shift. You have hunted its instruments your entire life. The things it made, the things it used. A pause. Is there something at the terminus worth hunting? Samus held his gaze through the visor with the steadiness of someone who had faced things considerably more immediately threatening than a Hirogen Alpha's assessment and had not looked away. Yes, she said. I believe there is. He studied her for long enough that the silence acquired its own weight. Now then we hunt together, he said. Hakatha. He said the word the way his culture said sacred things. Without theater, without performance, with the simple gravity of something that meant exactly what it was. Janeway allowed herself one quiet breath of relief. The Alpha turned to the trophy hall's far wall, where a mounted specimen Janeway couldn't identify occupied the most prominent position. Something large, something that had clearly been significant, something his eyes moved to with the particular reverence of a person's greatest achievement. When we reach the terminus, he said, I will mount what we take from it here. He looked back at them. You will be remembered in this hall, Captain Janeway. Both of you. The pale eyes found Samus again. When this is done, the hunt between us remains open. You understand this? I do, Samus said. Good. Something that was not quite a smile moved through his expression. The Hirogen approximation of respect, which looked like everything except warmth, and was, she had come to understand, the highest thing they offered. Then we are the same thing for 6 weeks. After that, we are what we have always been. Janeway extended her hand, because she always extended her hand, because it was the gesture her culture used to mark agreements between people, and she applied it to every species she encountered without apology. The Alpha looked at it for a moment, then clasped it, gently, with the deliberate restraint of someone who could have done otherwise and was choosing not to, which was its own kind of statement. Outside the trophy hall's viewport, the Delta Quadrant continued its vast, indifferent turning. 6 weeks ahead, something ancient and patient and enormous waited at a point in space where 2 universes' worth of entropy was preparing to meet itself. Behind them, at a distance measured in days and tactical reassessments, a Borg cube sat in the dark and thought its vast collective thoughts about completion and keys and the things that could not be rushed. And somewhere in the cellular memory of a bounty hunter who had never expected to find her people's last message in a corner of someone else's universe, the Chozo coordinates pulsed with the steady insistence of a warning that had been waiting 300 years to be received. 5 weeks, 4 days. The convergence point looked like nothing. That was the first thing, the absence of spectacle. Janeway had encountered enough cosmic phenomena to have developed an involuntary expectation of grandeur, the universe's tendency to announce its most significant events with appropriate visual drama. Subspace anomalies that tore light into spectrums that didn't have names. Nebulae that made the bridge crew stop talking without deciding to. The Borg transwarp conduits that opened like wounds in space and closed like they'd never existed. The Delta Quadrant had trained her toward awe the way certain landscapes train people toward faith, through accumulated exposure to things larger than the frameworks available to process them. The convergence point was a region of space that looked tired, and that was the only word Janeway could find for it as Voyager dropped out of warp at the Hirogen Alpha's agreed coordinate, a sector of the Delta Quadrant approximately 3 light-years across, where the stars were dimmer than they should have been, where the sensor readings carried a flatness that B'Elanna had spent 3 days failing to technically classify, where the background radiation of the universe registered at slightly lower than the surrounding region, as if something had been drawing on it for a very long time. A drain, the cosmological equivalent of a room where the air has been slowly leaving, and no one left inside can smell it anymore. The Hirogen vessels were already there. 4 of them. The Alpha had brought his full complement, which Janeway noted as the complement it was intended to be. They sat in a loose formation ahead of Voyager's position, running dark in the way Hirogen ships ran dark when they were waiting with intent rather than traveling, their sensor profiles minimized to the footprint of something that understood how to disappear against the background. The Alpha hailed immediately. "It is deeper than the scout readings suggested," he said. His voice carried something Janeway had not heard in it before. Not alarm, not the focused excitement of a hunt reaching its climax, but something older. The quality of a hunter confronting something that genuinely surprised him. The interior of the zone, the terminus point itself. Our probes returned incomplete data. The readings degraded before full sensor sweeps could complete. He paused. Something in the zone absorbed the probe signals. Absorbed, Janeway said. Ikha consumed, incorporated. They stopped transmitting not because they were destroyed, but because they became part of the background. Another pause. Like the Borg, but slower. 7 was at her console, running analysis on the probe data the Alpha transmitted alongside his report, her fingers moving with the focused urgency of someone whose 2 identities, the scientist and the former drone, were both fully engaged simultaneously. The convergence is active, she said. The condition the Choso documented, it has reached the terminus and begun the initial phase of what their message called ignition. We have, she ran the calculation, approximately 9 hours before the chain reaction achieves self-sustaining propagation. And after that, Chakotay asked, after that it requires no further terminus point. It propagates through the network it has already seeded, through Borg infrastructure, through residual phase-on contamination in adjacent dimensional spaces, through every civilization it has touched across both universes. She looked at Janeway. 9 hours. Janeway looked at the view screen, at the tired, dim sector of space that was quietly ending everything 3 light years in every direction, taking its time, not hurrying, because the convergence had never needed to hurry about anything. Options, she said. They had 3. The first was the Voyager option: fire every weapon the ship had at the terminus point center and hope that disrupting the convergence's physical locus interrupted the ignition process. 7 gave it a 12% probability of success and a 43% probability of accelerating the timeline by destabilizing the terminus before the chain reaction had fully organized. Janeway set it aside as the last resort that all last resorts were supposed to be. The second was the Hirogen option. The Alpha had proposed it during the joint tactical session, with the straightforward violence of a culture that had been solving problems with kinetic force for 100,000 years. His 4 vessels and Voyager's weapons combined in a coordinated strike pattern that the Alpha's tactical drones had spent 6 weeks designing. Better odds than Voyager alone. 28%, still insufficient. Janeway kept it in reserve. And the third option was what Samus had been building towards since the moment she read the Chozo message in the cube's chamber, since the coordinates had come through her cellular memory like a second pulse, since she had understood not just where the convergence was, but what the Chozo's documentation had been pointing toward from its very first encoded line. The terminus had a control architecture. The Chozo had not merely documented the convergence. In the centuries before their civilization's collapse, they had reached the terminus point and built something inside it. The same impulse that had driven them to build a repository inside what became the Borg cube. The same patient, disciplined engineering of people who understood they were running out of time and refused to leave the universe without a response. A mechanism designed to interrupt the ignition sequence at the terminus point itself, to collapse the convergence's locus before the chain reaction achieved self-sustaining propagation. Designed to be operated from inside the terminus zone. Designed to be operated by someone carrying Chozo biological encoding. Designed, Samus understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone reading a set of plans and recognizing their own measurements in them. For her. No, Janeway said, when Samus finished presenting it. The mechanism requires... I heard what it requires. Janeway's voice was level, which was the version of her voice that carried the most weight. Not raised, not sharp, but absolutely committed. It requires someone to enter the terminus zone, navigate to the control architecture while the convergence is actively incorporating everything within sensor range, operate a 3,000-year-old Chozo mechanism in an environment our sensors can't fully read, and get back out before the terminus collapses. She held Samus's gaze. In 9 hours. 8 hours, 40 minutes, 7 corrected without apology. In 8 hours, 40 minutes, Janeway said, and you want to do this alone. My suit handles the incorporative effect. 7's probe data shows the convergence absorbs signals, non-biological, electronic. The suit's biological integration gives it partial resistance. I can go deeper than any probe, any shuttle, any person without Chozo encoding. Samus said it the way she said all tactical assessments, with the complete, unsentimental accuracy of someone who had never found comfort in false optimism and had stopped looking for it a long time ago. You can't follow me in there, not far enough to matter. We can follow you part way, Chakotay said. Part way isn't far enough. It keeps you from being alone in something that eats signals. The briefing room held that for a moment. Samus looked at him, looked at Janeway, looked at the faces around the table. Bielana's fierce, worried focus. Kim's poorly concealed alarm running as it always ran just beneath his professional surface. Tuvok's stillness, which was not the stillness of someone who was unaffected, but of someone who had decided that what he felt was not the most useful thing to contribute right now. Tom Paris, who had stopped making the dry comments that were his armor and was just looking at her with the honest concern of someone who had flown into enough bad situations to know what the math looked like when someone wasn't planning to calculate a return trip. She had been alone for most of her life, not by accident, by construction, by the long, careful architecture of a person who had learned that people near her became leverage, became casualties, became the specific weight that broke things that couldn't afford to break. The suit was her shell and her weapon and her home and the Chozo's last conversation with the universe. And she had carried all of those things through every dark corridor and every impossible situation and every victory that cost more than the victory was worth. And she had carried them alone, because alone was the version of the equation that didn't include other people in the loss column. But she had spent 8 days aboard a ship that refused to treat her as a variable. That kept a transporter lock warm. That said you come back and meant it as an instruction rather than a hope. The Alpha, she said finally. His vessels can reach the first threshold of the convergence zone before signal degradation becomes critical. They have better sensor shielding than Voyager. Hirogen hunting technology is designed for environments that resist observation. She looked at Janeway. He stays at the threshold, maintains a biological lock on my suit as long as the signal holds. When the mechanism activates, when I trigger the collapse sequence, the terminus zone will discharge before it closes. And the discharge will be significant. How significant? B'Elanna asked. The Chozo documentation used the word catastrophic in a context that suggested it was an understatement. B'Elanna closed her eyes briefly. Of course it did. The discharge will propagate outward from the terminus point. Anything within the first threshold range when it happens gets caught in it, Janeway said. So the Alpha can't maintain the lock from threshold range. No. He positions at threshold, maintains the lock as long as possible, transmits a final coordinate fix to Voyager before signal degrades completely. Voyager holds position at safe range. When the discharge happens, when the terminus collapses, you use the coordinate fix to lock onto my suit signature in the aftermath and pull me out. She paused. Yeah, the suit will protect me through the collapse. The discharge itself, if the Chozo mechanism works correctly, lasts approximately 90 seconds. I survive 90 seconds inside a collapsing convergence terminus. Then you pull me out. And if the mechanism doesn't work correctly, Tuvok said, and the discharge lasts longer than 90 seconds. Samus said nothing. That's the part that isn't a plan, Janeway said quietly. That's the part that's a gamble. Everything out here is a gamble, Samus said. You've been making this kind of gamble for 3 years. You know how to do it. Janeway looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the star chart, at the tired, dim sector of space 3 light years ahead, at the 8 hours and 31 minutes remaining on Seven's timeline. She thought about all the choices she had made in this quadrant, the ones that held, the ones that cost, the ones she woke up at 0300 hours still examining from different angles to see if she had missed a version that kept everyone safe and still got the job done. She had never found one. The job always cost something. The question was always what and whether you could live with the arithmetic afterward. Chakotay, she said, get the Alpha on a secure channel. Tom, plot an approach to the first threshold and a withdrawal to safe range. I want both courses ready. B'Elanna, configure the transporter for a biological lock on suit-integrated organic material and keep it configured regardless of whatever interference the terminus is generating. You hold that lock manually if the computer drops it. She stood. 7. And I want continuous timeline updates. The moment the window changes, I want to know. She looked at Samus last. Walk with me, she said. They stood in the corridor outside the briefing room, the ship moving around them with its familiar sounds. The pulse of the warp drive, the soft cycling of life support, the distant voices of a crew preparing for something they understood was significant without knowing all its dimensions. Janeway had made peace with the fact that she couldn't protect her crew from everything. She had not made peace with it easily or completely, and she suspected she never would, and she had decided long ago that that was appropriate, that a captain who had fully made peace with loss had lost something more important than people. The Chozo built this for someone like you, she said. A mechanism that waited 3,000 years. A message encoded in a biological key. A repository designed to survive the Borg. She looked at Samus steadily. They went to extraordinary lengths to give whoever they made a chance at this. They believed it was possible. They didn't know who they were building it for, Samus said. No, but they knew what they were building. Janeway held her gaze. They built someone who would still be standing after everything they encountered. Someone who would read the message and understand it and walk toward the terminus instead of away from it. She paused. They built you well. Samus was quiet. In the corridor's light, the suit's plating carried the accumulated marks of 8 days in the Delta Quadrant. New scoring across the left shoulder from the Borg drone encounter. My heat discoloration along the arm cannon's casing from the convergence zone's outer radiation as they approached. The specific patina of something that had been through considerable things and was still standing. The Chozo's best work, still functional, still present, 8 days and 70,000 light years from where it had started. When this is done, Janeway said, we will find a way to get you home. I don't know how yet, but we will work on it with the same stubbornness we've applied to getting ourselves home. And if you knew us better, you'd understand that's not nothing. Something moved through Samus's stillness. Not visible exactly, but present. The specific internal shift of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting to receive and weren't entirely sure how to hold. I know it's not nothing, she said. Janeway nodded once. Then, let's go end this. The suit failed at the terminus point's core, not catastrophically, not all at once. The convergence's incorporative effect worked on electronic systems the way rust worked on metal. Gradually, then suddenly, the outer suit systems went first. Communications, long-range sensors, the non-essential architecture that the Chozo engineering had always been willing to sacrifice in order to protect the core. The visor flickered. The arm cannon's targeting systems dropped to manual. The morph ball matrix, the technology she'd never had cause to use aboard Voyager, went completely offline with the finality of something that understood it wasn't needed here. What remained was the suit's biological integration, the 11 neurological connection points the doctor had identified. On the interface between Chozo engineering and human Chozo biology, that was, at its foundation, not electronic at all, not something the convergence could incorporate, because it wasn't the kind of thing the convergence ate. It was alive. It was her. It was the specific, irreducible fact of a person inside the armor. And the convergence had no mechanism for absorbing that because it had never evolved one. The Chozo had known this, had built the mechanism accordingly. She found the control architecture at the terminus's center. Not a room, not a console, not anything with the comforting familiarity of technology she could recognize. The Chozo had built it 3,000 years ago for a place that resisted technology. So they had built it in a language the terminus couldn't eat. It was biological. Grown rather than constructed, and seeded into the terminus zone's deepest point with the patience of people who understood that some things had to be planted long before they were needed. It recognized her the moment she reached it. Not the suit, her. The cellular encoding responding to something it had always been waiting to respond to. The biological key meeting the biological lock at the end of a 3,000-year chain of custody. She triggered the collapse sequence with her bare hands, the suit's gauntlets open, her palm against something that felt like touching the memory of a civilization and being recognized by it. The terminus began to close. The discharge hit 90 seconds later, and it was everything the Chozo documentation had understated it would be. A wave of released convergence energy propagating outward from the terminus in every direction. The accumulated entropic potential of centuries of patient consumption, releasing all at once in a single enormous exhalation. She felt it move through the suit, through her, through the biological integration that was also her nervous system and her cells, and the Chozo engineering that had been her skeleton since childhood. The suit held. Barely. 90 seconds that were the longest 90 seconds of a life that had contained considerable competition for that title. The terminus collapsing inward around the mechanism, the discharge propagating outward, and her suspended between the two forces at the exact point that Choso had calculated, held by engineering 3,000 years old and the specific stubbornness of a person who had decided in a briefing room 8 days ago that she intended to come back. At 87 seconds, the transporter took her. It put her back together on Voyager's pad with the thoroughness of a chief engineer who had been holding a biological lock manually through catastrophic interference for 93 seconds and had not let go for a single one of them. Belana's voice rough with something she wasn't acknowledging. "I have her." Janeway from the bridge, with the specific quality of relief that didn't have a Starfleet appropriate name. "Is she?" "She's intact." A pause. "She's intact, Captain." Samus lay on the transporter pad and looked at the ceiling of a ship that was 70,000 light-years from her home and had pulled her out of a collapsing dimensional terminus with a manually held biological lock, and she thought, with the particular clarity of someone whose nervous system had just survived something it hadn't been entirely certain it would survive, that she owed Belana Torres an apology for the ventral maintenance seal. The suit systems were rebooting around her. Sequential, methodical, the Chozo engineering running its own self-assessment with the thoroughness of something designed to keep functioning after everything else stopped. The arm cannon came back first. It always came back first. She closed her fingers around it and held it and let that be enough for a moment. Outside, the tired, dim sector of space where the convergence had been was already changing. The stars returning to their proper luminosity, the background radiation climbing back toward baseline. The universe reasserting the version of itself that existed before something had been quietly drawing on it for centuries. The Delta Quadrant, indifferent as always, making no particular note of what had just happened in the space of a few hours, filing it with everything else it had swallowed and forgotten. 3,000 years of Chozo patience, paying out. Section 10. The aftermath had its own particular silence. Not the silence of absence, not the held breath quiet of a crew waiting for something to happen, but the silence that came after, the specific decompression of people who had been operating at the edge of their capacity for an extended period and were now cautiously beginning to believe the edge had receded. Voyager's crew moved through it with the practiced ease of people who had learned that aftermath was its own kind of work, that the distance between crisis and recovery was not a gap to fall into, but a terrain to navigate, and that the navigation required the same care as everything that preceded it. Janeway found Samus on the ship's observation deck at 0200 hours. She hadn't gone looking. She had been doing what she always did in the hours after a significant event. Walking the ship, checking in with her crew, taking the temperature of the vessel the way a doctor took a patient's pulse. Not because the readings would surprise her, but because the act of taking them was itself part of what kept the ship healthy. She had found Tom Paris in the mess hall eating something that defied classification and looking more at peace than she had seen him look in weeks. She had found Seven in astrometrics, recalibrating the long-range sensors with the focused attention of someone who processed recovery through productivity. She had found Belana asleep at an engineering console with her tools still in her hand and had covered her with the spare jacket she kept in her ready room for exactly these occasions. She found Samus at the observation deck's main viewport, standing in the position she always chose when she was thinking rather than watching. Facing the glass but not focused on anything specific in the starfield beyond, her attention directed inward while her eyes provided the comfortable neutral surface of deep space. The suit was fully restored. Every system that the terminus had degraded had rebuilt itself over the 4 hours since the transporter brought her back. The Chozo engineering running its patient self-repair with the thoroughness of something that had been designed to survive things its designers couldn't fully anticipate and to restore itself afterward without being asked. The arm cannon rested at its default position. The visor carried its familiar opacity. From the outside, she looked exactly as she had looked on the first day she materialized in Voyager's sickbay. Armored, complete. The shell that was also the person presenting no obvious evidence of what the past 8 days had cost. Janeway had learned to read the things that weren't obvious. She stood beside her at the viewport. Didn't speak immediately. There was a version of consideration that expressed itself as silence rather than words, and she had found in 8 days that Samus received it better than most people receive conversation. 7 recalibrated the long-range sensors, Janeway said eventually. She's been looking at the region where the terminus was. The convergence's incorporative effect has stopped. The background radiation is climbing back toward baseline. She paused. It worked. I know, Samus said. The Hirogen Alpha departed 4 hours ago. He left a message, audio only. I can play it for you if you want. What did he say? Janeway considered this. The Alpha's message had been brief and precise, delivered in the unhurried cadence of someone who had said exactly what they intended to say and had no interest in elaboration. He had named Samus in the Hakatha record. She would exist in the Hirogen's cultural memory now, in the Trophy Hall's catalog, in the oral tradition of the Quadrant's apex hunters. As the most significant prey he had encountered in 40 years of hunting, elevated further by the fact that she had functioned as partner rather than quarry for the duration of the convergence crisis. It was, in Hirogen terms, the highest possible testimony. It was also, Janeway had noted, the beginning of something rather than the end. The Alpha's final line had been delivered with the particular quality of a promise being recorded rather than a conclusion being drawn. He said you are the worthiest prey he has encountered, Janeway said, and that the hunt between you remains open, and that he will be patient. Something moved through Samus's stillness, not quite amusement, but the shape that amusement left in someone who had been mostly stripped of its lighter expressions by a life that hadn't offered many opportunities to practice them. Good, she said. I'd be disappointed otherwise. Janeway smiled. She looked at the star field, at the Delta Quadrant's vast indifferent dark, at the distant smear of light that was the region where the terminus had been and was no longer, at the stars that were already marginally brighter than they had been yesterday, now that something had stopped drawing on them. I've been thinking about what the Chozo built, she said. The repository, the biological key, the mechanism at the terminus. She paused. They spent the last centuries of their civilization building something that would survive long enough to be found by someone who could use it. They didn't know your name. They didn't know your timeline or your universe, or the specific sequence of events that would bring you to a corner of someone else's quadrant with their message in your cells. She looked at Samus. But they knew what they were building, and they built it well enough that it arrived at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right hands. Another pause, smaller. I find that remarkable. Samus was quiet for a moment. The star field moved with the ship's travel. Voyager back on its heading, course resumed, the relentless navigation toward a home that was still years away, but remained the fixed point everything else was measured against. When they were remarkable people, she said. The words carried the specific weight of an understatement chosen deliberately, not because the truth was too large to speak, but because some truths had been carried long enough that speaking them simply required economy. I've spent most of my life in their ruins, learning from what they left behind, carrying what they built into me. She looked at the viewport. I didn't know there was more left to find. There may be more still, Janeway said. The repository inside the cube. The Chozo preserved it specifically to survive and be found. Whatever the terminus mechanism contained, whatever they built out here, it was one piece of what they left across this quadrant. She let that sit for a moment. The collective still has the fragment, partially processed, quarantined, waiting for a key it no longer has. But the cube is still out there. Samus looked at her. I know, Janeway said. I'm not suggesting we go back. I'm noting that the inventory of what remains to be understood is longer than we knew 8 days ago. A beat. Which means your reasons for being in this quadrant are also longer. I was already in this quadrant with no way home, Samus said. My reasons for being here didn't require augmentation. No, but having them changes the quality of the stay. Janeway looked at her with the directness she reserved for conversations that mattered. I meant what I said yesterday. We will find a way to get you home. Balana has been going over your ship's propulsion data every spare hour for 8 days. She hasn't said this out loud yet, but she has a theory about the Chozo Gate's energy signature and whether it left a residual dimensional trace. She'll tell you about it tomorrow morning whether you want her to or not. Something in Samus's bearing shifted, the small, particular softening of someone who had been given something they hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with, and were not, despite all of that, inclined to return it. The doctor also wants to complete his medical scan, Janeway added. He's been composing his argument for why you should allow it for 3 days. I expect it's quite thorough at this point. I'll consider it. He'll be devastated by that answer and deeply motivated by it simultaneously. Nara, you'll have given him a project. She paused. He does better with projects. They stood together at the viewport in the ship's deep night quiet, the Delta Quadrant wheeling past them in its patient, indifferent beauty. Stars that had been burning before humanity had language to name them, and would be burning long after, scattered across distances that made every individual journey across them feel simultaneously insignificant and extraordinary. The specific paradox of exploration, which Janeway had spent her career inside and had never fully resolved and suspected, couldn't be fully resolved, and had decided that was appropriate. Vorik asked me to convey his gratitude, Janeway said. Formally, he practiced the specific wording. He wanted to make sure it was sufficiently, he used the word precise. Tell him it was operationally necessary, Samus said. He'll appreciate that considerably. Janeway looked at her. I won't tell him that's what you said. I'll tell him you received his gratitude and acknowledged it, which is also true. Samus looked at her. The visor was, as always, unreadable, but Janeway had spent 8 days learning the other registers, and what she read in the set of Samus's shoulders, in the angle of her attention, in the particular quality of the silence she occupied right now, was not the silence of someone who was alone. It was the silence of someone who was, carefully, provisionally, with every safeguard intact and every old habit preserved, considering that they might not have to be. Thank you, Samus said. It was simple and direct and cost something, which was why it carried the weight it did. Thank you, Janeway said, for walking toward it instead of away. The ship moved through the dark. Somewhere below them in the shuttle bay, an orange and gold vessel sat with its forward thruster array partially disassembled. Bilana's tools laid out beside it in the specific organized pattern of an engineer who had been interrupted mid-thought by a convergence crisis and was planning to return to the problem first thing in the morning. The dimensional trace theory, the residual signature, the possibility, not yet spoken aloud, not yet tested, held carefully in the space between hypothesis and hope. The Delta Quadrant extended ahead of them. Weeks of it, months. The relentless distance between where they were and where they were going, measured in star dates and fuel cells, and the particular stubbornness of a crew that had made a collective decision, years ago, that they were going home and had not once seriously considered revising it. 2 ships now. 2 crews by the provisional definition that 8 days and 1 convergence terminus had created between them. 2 sets of coordinates they were navigating toward, by different routes, along the same stretch of quadrant. In the collective's vast and patient memory, somewhere deep in the quarantine fragment of a 3,000-year-old Chozo preservation team's final transmission, a set of coordinates still waited. Not spatial, temporal. Layered beneath the piece the terminus mechanism had unlocked. Beneath the message Samus had read with her hands and her cells at the center of a collapsing dimensional terminus, there was one more layer. The Chozo had been thorough. They always had been. The fragment pulsed. The collective thought its long thoughts about completion and keys and the things that could not be rushed. And in the observation deck of a starship 70,000 light-years from home, a bounty hunter who had spent her life in the ruins of the people who made her stood at the edge of the dark and looked out at what remained to be found, and did not look away. The convergence was gone. The terminus had collapsed, the chain reaction interrupted at the precise moment the Chozo had calculated. And 3,000 years of patient engineering paying out in 90 seconds of catastrophic discharge that left the sector marginally brighter than it had been before. The Delta Quadrant filed it without ceremony among everything else it had witnessed and forgotten, but the things the convergence had touched remained. The Borg cube sat somewhere behind Voyager's wake, its quarantine fragment reconfigured, its vast collective memory now aware that the key it had carried for 3 centuries had opened something, and the something pointed onward. The Hirogen Alpha updated his trophy record and set a new course, patient as geological time. And aboard a Federation starship that was still years from home, a bounty hunter who had never expected to find her people's last words in someone else's quadrant was sitting with the knowledge that the inventory of what the Chozo left behind was longer than she had known. The immediate crisis was resolved. The larger one was only beginning to reveal its shape. Voyager moved through the dark toward home, carrying more than it had 8 days ago. A damaged ship in the shuttle bay, a theory not yet spoken aloud, a fragment of Choso memory that pointed somewhere, and a hunter who had walked toward the end of the world and walked back out. The Delta Quadrant watched them go, as it watched everything, with patient and absolute indifference. The legend had only just begun. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. More stories await.